Hello students, and welcome to your online Survey of Human Anatomy and Physiology class. We're going to look at Chapter 16, the respiratory system. The functions of the respiratory system is to supply oxygen from the air to the body cells and to transport carbon dioxide from the body to the air. It helps in speech, passing the air over the vocal cords, the use of the tongue, and the resonance coming from the sinuses help us to speak and enunciate our words. There is a role played with the regulation of the acid-base balance, pH, body defensive against infections, and we'll go over that, and hormonal regulation of blood pressure happens within the respiratory system. The process of respiration. Respiration is the process of exchanging gases between the atmosphere and the body cells. It consists of the following events: breathing, or ventilation as it's called, moving air in and out of the lungs. There is a gas exchange between the air in the lungs and the blood, and the oxygen, carbon dioxide, is transported by the blood, and then there is the exchange between the blood and the cells. The oxygen is given to the interstitial fluids into the cells, and then the carbon dioxide moves from the cells to the blood to be taken back to the heart, to the lungs, for the process to begin again. Cellular respiration is the breaking down of food into usable parts, and with the help of oxygen, cellular respiration takes place, and from that cellular respiration we have the making of ATPs, and a waste product of this process is carbon dioxide. Organs of the respiratory system, just an overview here. We'll go through this quickly. There are other videos already posted on your website, and so I'm going to move through this quickly because you have probably seen this before. We have the frontal sinus and the ethmoidal sinuses here. Again, it helps with the resonance. The nasal cavity, the hard palate with the palatine bone and the vomer bone, and then the soft palate, the oral cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the pharynx giving rise to the larynx and the esophagus to take food to the stomach, and then the trachea, the passageway of the air to the lungs, the bronchus, and the right and left lung. Broken down a little bit further, here we have the nostril, goes into the nasal cavity, the nose and the nasal cavities. You have the superior, these bones that look like, if you curl your fingers up, that's the way these bones appear. If you're looking directly at the bones, as we looked at the skull, when we're looking at the skeletal system, you saw these curled bones, the nasal concha, superior, middle, and inferior concha, conchae or concha. And in between there is a space, a passageway called meatus, and with the shape of the bones and then the soft tissue overlaying these bones, mucous membranes here, it increases the surface area and it allows for the movement of air, a great deal of movement through this passageway of air to sort of circulate the air here with increased surface area. Okay, so that is the nasal cavity. And then again, the frontal sinus and the sphenoidal sinus helps with resonance. It really doesn't aid in the circulation of air. There's no really direct airflow into the sinuses. It just helps to resonate your voice whenever you're speaking. That's why when you have a sinus infection and you have buildup of mucus in this area, it can change your voice, the way your voice resonates or sounds. Okay, so this area is the nasal area, and then it leads to the oral, and again this is the pharynx, and we have gone through this before when we were looking at the digestive system. This is the nasopharynx, and then you have the oral pharynx behind this passageway, the mouth. Usually the air comes through the nose, the nostril, into the nasal cavity, the nasopharynx, and then the oropharynx, and down to the laryngopharynx. Okay, so let's look at the tonsils. You have the pharyngeal tonsils here directly behind or posterior to the nasal cavity, and then you have the hard palate here with the palatine bone and the vomer bone. And remember, you would actually have that perpendicular plate here, that nasal septum, but we have the bone removed here so you can see into that nasal cavity. So this hard palate would be the bone, palatine, and then the soft palate would be the tissue overlaying that bone with the uvula hanging down, and right on either side there would be two palatine tonsils on either side of the uvula, and this is usually the tonsils that the healthcare provider is looking at when they're trying to check to see if you have a sore throat, or when they remove the tonsils. These are usually the tonsils that they remove. And sometimes the adenoid, which is actually the pharyngeal tonsils, or adenoids, okay, and the palatine tonsils. And then you have the tongue, and posterior to the tongue you have the lingual tonsil, linguist, speech. The lingual tonsil is posterior to the tongue. You have the hyoid bone here, and this is soft tissue. The esophagus, again, that closes that air passageway when you swallow, and this is the beginning of the larynx. So the pharynx here is the laryngopharynx that leads to the esophagus, and the larynx to the voice box, where you have the vocal cords here, to the trachea. The nose has the nostrils, which are the opening to the nasal cavity, and in between you have that vomer bone that gives rise to the perpendicular plate that has soft tissue lining that bone perpendicular plate that forms that septum, divides into the right and left nasal cavity area. Okay, and then the nasal concha, as we had gone over before. This is all part of the upper respiratory tract. This is lined with ciliated epithelial tissue, epithelium, columnar pseudostratified, meaning that it appears to be stratified, which would be more than one layer of cells, but actually it's not. So it's called pseudostratified. Columnar, remember we saw or heard that name before. It is rectangular cells that are ciliated. So at the apex or the top of that cell to the opening of that passageway, there is going to be cilia, hair-like structures that help to move the mucus and whatever particles are found in that mucus along. Goblet cells are found there that produce mucin that mixes with water, and mucin and water makes mucus. These air-filled spaces reduce the weight of the skull and also help with resonance when you are speaking. So you have the maxillary, the frontal, the sphenoidal, ethmoid sinuses. Okay, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngeal pharynx we just spoke about just a few minutes ago. The oropharynx here, the nasopharynx here, the oropharynx here, and the laryngopharynx here. And as the laryngopharynx is the beginning of the lower respiratory tract, or the larynx, and gives rise to the voice box, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Gives rise to the trachea, and the tracheal to the bronchial tree, and then to the lungs. The larynx is the voice box. It appears larger in males because of testosterone, enlarges the voice box so that the Adam's apple on the anterior neck is larger in males than it is in females. Okay, you have the thyroid cartilage, is large anterior cartilage that makes up the Adam's apple. Here you have the hyoid, that floating bone on that epiglottic cartilage right here. Thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. Now, the thyroid cartilage does not go all the way around, it stops, but the cricoid cartilage forms a complete circle around the beginning of the trachea. It is the lowest border here. The epiglottis, this is the anterior view, this is the posterior view. Now, you see the C rings of, it's actually hyaline cartilage of the trachea. It's an incomplete circle because when you swallow your food, that esophagus expands, and so this does not need to be rigid, it needs to give, and so the trachea needs to give a little bit, so these cartilage rings are not complete, they're really in a C shape. Okay, thyroid, this is the section of the thyroid cartilage, and then the cricoid cartilage. Notice how it's larger posteriorly than it is anteriorly. And another person, I heard another person say before that it looks like a ring, like a senior ring, with the larger part of the ring posterior and the smaller part anterior. You also have the corniculate cartilage, is in between the epiglottic cartilage, arytenoid cartilage, right before you get to the cricocartilage and then the trachea. But these are really the most important ones for you to remember now in this class is the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage. The epiglottis, the flap which covers the windpipe during swallowing. The vocal cords, as you go, you see the epiglottis and you look down through that opening. This gives rise to the trachea, the inner lining of the trachea there. This open area is just a space. An open area is called the glottis. So epi means upon, and so that flap of cartilage that folds over when you swallow covers up the glottis so food does not go through. So the epiglottis is that flap of tissue above it, and then the opening itself is called the glottis. Here the glottis is closed, but that crease right there where you would have the opening is called the glottis. You have true vocal cords and then false vocal cords. The false vocal cords are superior to the true vocal cords. Okay, so the false vocal cords above as you're looking down at the glottis. The true vocal cords are actually forming the glottis. And there you have the true vocal cords and the false vocal cords. The trachea is the windpipe. There you have the larynx, which consists of thyroid cartilage and cricocartilage. Your cartilaginous rings, those C-shaped rings that are anterior. You see the ring anteriorly on the trachea. Before we go on, as we're looking at the upper respiratory tract and the beginning of the lower respiratory tract, here you have the thyroid cartilage and the cricoid cartilage, the thyroid gland, and if they have to do a tracheotomy, then here is the sternal notch on the sternum, the uppermost portion of the sternum, and there's the trachea. Right below the thyroid gland, above the sternal notch, is where they would do an incision for a tracheostomy. This is performed to allow air to bypass an obstruction in the larynx. Okay, the bronchial tree, and this is a really cool picture where the tissue, actual real tissue, has been stained with different colors, and this would represent the different branches of this bronchial tree. And actually those are representing the bronchopulmonary unit, the different bronchopulmonary units of that bronchial tree. You have, it branches off the bronchial tree from the trachea to the primary bronchi, that goes from the trachea to begins that first bifurcation or branching off to the right and left bronchi to the lungs. Secondary is even smaller. It goes from the primary bronchi to the lobes of the lungs. Tertiary bronchi are even smaller. It's branched off more. And then you have the tertiary bronchi give rise to the bronchopulmonary units. And these units have, it's almost like you get a cluster of grapes and you have a main little branch, and then it branches off, and then it branches off again, and then you have a branch that has a cluster of grapes. And if you can imagine that, this would be like a bronchopulmonary unit. So it has a little cluster of alveoli encircled by many, many, many capillaries, arterioles and capillaries and venules. Now if you'll look very closely here, you'll notice that the left lung here only has 2 lobes, but the right lung has 3 lobes. Now why is that? Well, you need to have room for the heart, and the heart would be nestled right here in that left half of that heart, you know, is much more developed and more muscular, larger than the right, so you need a little more space here on the left side of the space for that for the heart. Okay, so you're only going to have a superior lobe and a left inferior lobe, a left superior lobe and a left inferior lobe, where on the right side you have a right superior lobe, right middle lobe, and then a right inferior lobe. Okay, so here is the larynx, the voice box here, the trachea, and these bronchi the bronchus will bifurcate or branch off, and so immediately after it branches off is called the primary bronchus. And so this would be the right primary bronchus, and this would be the left primary bronchus. And then you have more branching, and that would be the secondary bronchus. Okay, then you have more branching, and that would be the tertiary bronchus. As you get closer to these clusters of alveoli, it's called the terminal bronchiole. The terminal bronchiole, and that's getting close to the end of the run, so it's called terminal bronchiole. Okay, then as you get to this cluster of alveoli, an alveolus is only one, alveoli is many, and so as you get to this cluster of alveoli, this the bronchi branches, the bronchiole branches and branches until you get to this cluster of alveoli, and so right before you get to that cluster, it's called the alveolar duct. Okay, so it goes from the terminal bronchioles to the alveolar duct to the alveolus with the alveolar. Okay, now all the way along this respiratory tract, you're going to have smooth muscle that wraps around these branches of the bronchial tree, and you continue on and you'll have this smooth muscle all along the way, all the way to the bronchopulmonary unit, all the way down to these alveolar sacs, these clusters of alveoli. Okay, so you have the pulmonary artery. Pulmonary artery will branch into arterioles, and arterioles will branch down into capillaries, and so you have a capillary network on the surface of the alveolus. So as we mentioned before, the alveolus is a simple squamous epithelial cell thick. So that means one cell, that flattened pancake-like cell with a bulge where the nucleus is, one cell thick. And those capillaries, remember, are only one cell thick. So because these are only one cell thick, and then the alveolus sac is only one cell thick, then it's easily there is a easy exchange of gases here at the alveolar sac. Here's that simple squamous epithelium, just a single layer. Okay, and that is the alveolus, that air sac. Simple squamous epithelial cells. And then you have the cross-section of capillaries here. Now, with the emphysema, a cell, or the alveolus, the alveoli would, in an emphysema lung, it would, like this wall would be removed here in this wide open space, so that you wouldn't have as much of the alveolar space where you would have exchange between the capillaries and the simple squamous epithelium, because it would be missing here. So you do not do a good job on exchanging those gas particles. Okay, the lungs. Again, you have the right superior lobe, the right primary bronchus, the secondary bronchus, that branches off, tertiary bronchus, all the way down to the terminal, right before you get to that alveolar sac, the terminal bronchiole, and down to the alveolar duct, to the alveolus. This should be just review for you. We know that the directly on the surface of the lung would be visceral, and the word we use for lungs is pleura. So visceral pleura, and then in this thoracic cavity would be lined, or the pleural cavity would be lined with parietal pleura. And in between, these are serous membranes. So we know that serous membranes produce serous fluid. So there would be just a simple layer of fluid between the membrane that's lining the cavity and the membrane that's lining the organ itself, the lung. So on the surface of the lung would be the visceral pleura, and on the surface of the cavity would be the parietal pleura. And then you have the pericardium around the heart and the pericardial cavity, or the visceral pericardium or pericardial cavity. Okay, visceral pleura, parietal pleural. Viscera on the surface of the lung, parietal in the cavity, and the pleural cavity is the space in the thoracic cavity that contains the lungs. Boyle's law is where we'll pick up next time.